First of all, the Trump administration, it was the Trump administration, the Justice Department decided to start this policy of separating children from their families. That was a Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, and John Kelly in the White House. They decided that this is what they're going to do. Now, many of the cases, I mean, people who are being held, and I'm not talking about children, this is a lawful procedure that they are seeking, right? They're not, I mean, it's not illegal to come to the United States to seek asylum. You have to apply for it, but they're being, these people have come here expecting to follow a lawful procedure, and they've been incarcerated.
Incarcerated or turned back and not even allowed to apply for asylum in any kind of a timely manner. There have been a couple of changes in policy over the last year to 2 years. One has been that people not arriving at ports of entry have been denied the right to apply for asylum, which was in clear contradiction of U.S. law. That has been challenged in court and enjoined because the law is so clear that anyone arriving at any place along a border or at a port of entry in the United States, including airports, can seek asylum at that point. Now you've got a remain in Mexico policy that requires asylum seekers to return to Mexico while they await an initial interview, which could be months in the future.
Or years.
Or, well, you know, there's a big backlog and a long wait for asylum applicants, and they don't feel safe in Mexico.
Well, and the point is, many of these people who are waiting in Mexico and who came here to seek asylum, they're not from Mexico.
Correct.
They're from Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, right?
Yes.
I mean,
El Salvador and Honduras.
Right, and they're being forced to wait in Mexico.
Correct.
Where they have no sense of being, no community. And what are they? They're establishing migrant camps down there, aren't they?
Well, yes, they are, and it gets even worse because there are U.S. attorneys and humanitarian workers who, for years, were providing services to asylum seekers on the Mexico side of the border, and some of them have been targeted for arrest and deportation from Mexico based reportedly on information that was gathered through surveillance of these humanitarian workers and lawyers. So I know of lawyers who have been deported from Mexico for no other reason that they were there to assist asylum seekers.
I mean, and the New York Times, the El Paso Times, pardon me for going back to this, they did this story, and they've talked to a lot of former employees and a lot of Border Patrol agents who wanted to remain anonymous. They're talking about this child facility in Clint, Texas, and which is now the epicenter of all of the protests. They say that there are children there as young as 3 months old, that there are toddlers in that center being held.
Well, I'm not an expert on the conditions in that particular center. I know it's been reported on. I think it's in today's New York Times. The administration really needs to formulate a humanitarian policy for dealing with families that arrive in the United States, for enforcing the Flores settlement that has been an agreed-upon way of dealing with unaccompanied minors and minors who are in custody for the last 20 or so years. But instead, the administration wants to gut the settlement and have legislation to overturn it. And it's just the wrong way to go. We don't hear any creative initiatives for helping children grow up with productive conditions
Miss
around
Pollock,
them.
you assume that this administration has any humanitarian bones about it. I mean, this administration has shown itself. I mean, for example, this Homeland Security did a report, their own watchdog, about this facility in Texas and how bad it is and how it's scathing. It's a scathing report. And Donald Trump says, oh, it's fine. They're doing fine. Oh, they're well run. These facilities are well run.
Well, one thing is you can't trust anything that the administration is saying to you.
Tell me a little bit about the Flores decision so that I and the listeners understand it.
Sure. Well, the Flores decision came about, it was a settlement of a lawsuit that had gone up and down in the courts for years, had been up and down from the Supreme Court. Finally, the government and it was a nationwide class action lawsuit on behalf of minors in detention, and basically it sets out a roadmap for how they are to be released, because U.S. law does not permit the indefinite detention of minors. So essentially, it created a framework for what either licensed facilities or individuals who were eligible to accept minors in detention. And
including the government?
It can be centers that have been, licensed as child care facilities, but if there are relatives of the minor in the United States, be they parents or aunts or uncles or cousins or siblings or grandparents, they are the favored recipients of the kids.
The kids have to be released to their custody.
Correct, within a certain amount of time, and if not, of course, the government is amenable to a lawsuit or being held in contempt of court. And this has really come into conflict with the current policies of the administration, which have been referred to as zero tolerance and which are designed to provide, allegedly designed to provide deterrence to people in desperate situations.
That's their excuse, yeah.
And so, these, what I consider to be atrocities and state abuses of children occur without a second thought, because this is the way that the administration is viewing the situation, that by doing these very inhumane things, they'll be somehow controlling a situation that really originates in Central America. The whole issue of gang violence in these countries, which, had its genesis in the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s, when a lot of these folks were deported to these countries and established gang presences there. Now it's coming back to haunt us because they are de facto governments in these areas that they control, and they are putting so much pressure and committing such violent acts against the populace in these areas that you do have these mass departures. And so the big issue of our times, the humanitarian issue right now, is how to deal with this influx of asylum seekers. And, the administration, of course, is trying to deal with it in a very ham-handed fashion to keep people from even getting to the United States or from getting in to pursue their legal claims for asylum.
Well, then, in the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions and General Kelly, by the way, they espoused this policy of separating families because they thought that would deter the migrants from coming into this country. So they separated family. They took the children. Wasn't there a court decision on the Flores decision? Didn't they say to the Trump administration. You have to let these. There's a. I mean, it's something like 20 to 30 days, right?
Well, yes, and
Period.
absolutely, the courts have been very involved. A U.S. District Court judge has affirmed the Flores settlement and has ordered that it be enforced, that it continue to be enforced. The administration has appealed that to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Basically, to the delight of their supporters, the administration does not back down. And it will continue to try to gut the Flores decision. The current playing field is they're trying to pass legislation in Congress. Well, with the Democrats controlling the House, that is not going to happen. So, it's like a balloon. They're pressing in one place and another until they can, achieve what they're
Well, but the
hoping.
bottom line is there are literally hundreds of children being held in. I call them concentration camps, and somebody else likened them to the concentration camps. But these detention centers, hundreds of children being held way beyond the deadline set by the Flores decision.
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, about 6 months ago, a federal judge ordered the Trump administration to reunite the families.
Yes.
And yet you tell me, and I know we've had the ACLU in here, that they're down in some of these Central American countries still trying to find the families of these children who've been separated?
Right. Well, the ACLU has been fantastic on the legal front, and they have had a series of stunning victories in the courts to turn back a lot of the policies, or to stall them at least. And they continue to do just amazing work, and should be given all the the kudos that exist. But they still are facing an extremely resistant executive branch, and we immigration lawyers face that on a daily basis. We have seen the favorable exercises of discretion just completely taken away in many instances. Clients who previously would have been left alone. There are no priorities for removal these days. It's just anybody who they run across who does not have current legal status will be arrested.
Tell me about your client.
Well, we actually were in court on July 2nd to seek a emergency restraining order on the removal of one of our clients. Our client had been living in the United States for close to 30 years, is married to a U.S. citizen, applied for a green card, has just a pretty amazing backstory, but in all respects qualified for her green card, for permanent residence in the United States. But because there was an old administrative removal order that had been entered against her back in 1990, the immigration authorities decided that would trump all other considerations, and that she had to be deported.
They're going to deport her. Really?
Well, she was supposed to be gone from the United States this past Sunday. We were able to file the lawsuit, get the agency to reconsider its current position, and we're hoping that we'll be able to work out a negotiated settlement whereby she'll be allowed to stay. But she's got at least a 60-day reprieve at this point.
But she's been here 30 years, and she's married to a U.S. citizen, and
That's
she
correct.
Otherwise qualifies for a green card.
Correct. So anybody who takes the position, why don't they just get in line, should take this as a cautionary tale. There is no line. The immigration laws are complicated, and there's lots of rules and exceptions to the rules, and exceptions to the exceptions to the rules. And basically, getting justice from this system is pretty random.
Well, here's the other thing. This administration, the president said a couple of weeks ago that the ICE was going to start deporting millions of undocumented immigrants. First of all, that was a lie. Let's just be blunt about it, because they weren't going to do it. But what they were going to do was try to round up about 2,000 of undocumented immigrants whose removal orders had already been issued. And that was what ICE was going to do. Now it has been, they're going to start it all over again. Trump said he was going to do it, delay it for 2 days or 2 weeks. Now they're going to start it all over again. It has struck fear throughout the Hispanic community. I mean, there's an article about the fear in Little Village and Pilsen and some of these areas. I mean, they say businesses, some of them are practically closing because people are afraid to come out on the streets as a result of this administration's decision to begin removing people. What would you advise people to do? I mean, are you part? I mean, there's a movement out there trying to advise persons who might be involved. What would you advise them to do?
Well, I have been advising them
really
since January of 2016, when the new administration, when the inauguration occurred, there was panic in immigrant communities.
And justifiably so.
Based on all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that had been spewed out during the campaign. So, there's fear is well justified. But what I've been telling people since then is that while the rhetoric has ramped up, you cannot trust everything that they're saying. Operationally, the laws have not changed. A lot of the government agents are the same ones that were, operating prior to the Trump administration, and there are no real increases in appropriations for operations. So
it's impossible. It is impossible by their own admission to deport millions of undocumented immigrants.
Right. And there are what the administration is saying now with regard to its current rhetoric about deporting thousands of people with final removal orders. Basically, they are going for the low fruit, the easy pickings for people who are legally amenable to deportation without further process. And some of these people may not have relief available, but others do. For example, my client has other relief available. And I think it's important that anyone who is fearful about their situation get good advice from a good immigration attorney or a community organization that has immigration counsel and knows what they're talking about.
There's a lady in Columbus, Ohio, and she's been here 2 decades, and she's living in the Mennonite Church in Columbus, Ohio, for 21 months because they're trying to deport her, and she came here 2 decades ago. So, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, sent her a letter, and they said she's willfully refused to leave the country, and this is a quote, she had connived or conspired to prevent her deportation, and they're going to and she owes the government now $500,000. You're telling me about the Constitution?
Right. I mean, the Constitution of the U.S., the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, contains a clause that prohibits the imposition of excessive fines. It seems like this would qualify as
$500,000.
There's also all sorts of due process concerns about assessing this kind of a fine on her without notice or, but I think people need to realize that these fine letters that are coming out now, and they are hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there are more and more of them, and they are targeting people who are trying to comply with the laws in their own way. But all of this was made legal under a law that was passed in 1996 and signed by President Bill Clinton. A lot of our current issues come from that 1996 law that basically kept people from voluntarily leaving the United States in order to come back legally. Now they're barred from coming back for 10 years or more. And so, both political parties have their, hands in creating the current situation.
Yeah, well, ICE says that there's an act out there that permits them to fine $799 a day, fine undocumented immigrants, $799 a day.
So that stems from the 1996 law.
From Bill Clinton.
Sure.
So what you're saying is, all parties are responsible for this.
Oh, absolutely. You'll hear often Trump administration officials and Trump himself referring back to things that the Obama administration did as sort of justifications as to why he's doing this. Of course, they're not looking for solutions, any kind of creative
justification.
They're just looking for justification. It doesn't make it right what they're doing, but certainly Obama, who was, name tagged the deporter in chief, because he deported more numbers of people than anybody prior to him. Both parties have to come together to create solutions. They haven't for decades.
Two things about this. First of all, Obama did not separate children and families.
That was the current administration's policy.
Right.
What Obama did was he created these family detention centers. And yes, he kept the families together in detention. That was an atrocity in and of itself. But, he was being a hardliner on immigration at the time.
And secondly, there was a solution to this proposed and promoted by George W. Bush.
Well, George W. Bush always, through his family connections, and his brother was married to an immigrant, and always had a soft heart and, a keen spirit as an American of America as a nation of immigrants. Here, now, you never hear that discussed as one of our founding principles. You get USCIS officials refusing to acknowledge that it's paying public, our customers, that they're not entitled to customer service, that their main mission is to enforce the immigration laws. There's been a total 180-degree shift in tone. And, it was much different. The tone was different. Under
well,
George
when a guy
W.
comes
Bush.
down the escalator to make his announcement that he's running for president, and he talks about Mexico sending rapists and criminals here, what do you expect?
Yeah, you don't expect much.
Right. You want to take a few phone calls?
Be happy to.
All right, folks, 773-763-9278. That's our number if you want to get in touch with Scott Pollock. You have any questions about undocumented immigrants, etc., give us a call here. We're waiting for your calls. Lines are now open again, 773-763-9278. Meanwhile, you have these centers with these children. Stories about young girls standing around the toilet facilities to protect other young girls who are trying to go. I mean, to keep them from being seen by others. You have children in these detention centers, 15, 16, 17 years old, are being asked to change diapers of young children in these detention centers because the border guards and the border patrol in these centers say, we're not nurses, we're not doctors. And they're asking these other young people to do it. And in another case, you had a father who was looking for his two sons, and they needed medicine for epilepsy. and he didn't even know where they were. That's the conditions that exist today in these centers.
And not just at those centers, but really in many ICE detention facilities around the country, the issue of appropriate provision of medical care has been an issue for years. People are not given their medication that they need, or they're made to wait too long. When I was down in Dilley, Texas, there was an outbreak of upper respiratory illnesses that was pretty shocking and pretty scary for people working in the facility trying to help these people.
Yeah, they call them flu cells now. They've got cells, particular cells for these kids, flu cells. I just wanted to give you folks a chance to get in on any questions you have. 773-763-9278. Some of you might have a question for Scott, and you might have comments on these this immigration, undocumented immigrant situation. I know Pablo is on the line right now, so let's take our first call from Pablo. Again, 773-763-9278. Pablo, you're on.
Thank you. I heard the rumor. I don't know if it's true, but it's a little wild. But I wonder if it makes any sense to your guests. The rumor is this: that since prisons that are holding undocumented people are a for-profit business now, there's an incentive. It's a money-making thing, so it serves them well to keep as many people there. That way they charge taxpayers a lot of money. In essence, they're cleaning the taxpayers, the American taxpayers, with these prisons. The rumor was that there are people in Central America telling people, and that it began before the elections of 2018, telling them now is the time to go. The Democrats are gonna win, and they're gonna let you through. They're gonna let you in. But it was just to stuff the prisons with undocumented people. Not only that, to scare the American people to vote for Republicans, because now we have an invasion of people, and that is served politically in more than one way. Does it make sense? Is it any truth to the rumor?
I haven't heard from any Central American who has come to the United States that they were motivated by a rumor of this type that you're talking about. When I was in Texas, I consulted with probably over 100 people over the course of a week and was assessing their stories about why they came to the United States. And to a person,
Pablo, I got to hang up on you, Pablo. Sorry about that. It's too noisy. Go ahead, Scott.
So everybody had a very compelling story to tell. The stories were individualized. They were not canned. They were not pre-prepared. You know, I've been interviewing asylum seekers for over 30 years, and while there are some people who are good liars, these were pretty unsophisticated people. And when I would ask, you know, what caused you to leave your home, nobody said, we heard that the Democrats would let us in. That was, you know, just not in their calculation. Everybody was being, victimized, or they were subject to various push factors that made them uproot themselves and, grab one or more of their kids to try to reach safety or more safe situation.
Well, essentially, what you explained in the beginning, you know, it's the gangs in Central America and the cartels, right? I mean, the threats to their lives and to their safety.
And it's also, you know, a system where governments will not protect women against domestic violence. It's not in their laws or in their culture or in the resources of the police to handle that situation. Often abusers will, kill people with impunity because either they're part of the government or the police, or they have connections with authority figures, and people ask for protection like we would call the police if we felt unsafe, and they get turned away. They're told, some of them are told, you better leave the country if you want to seek safety.
I know, and now, is the answer, a couple of questions, is the answer to stop some of this sending more enforcement down to the border, isn't the answer to send more judges, more judges who qualified on asylum laws, and more attorneys to speed up the system so that we get more cases taken care of, as opposed to just worrying about enforcement of the border and building a wall?
Dick, I think that's exactly what has to happen. But, Congress isn't allocating more resources to the courts. And when I was doing my week of pro bono work, we appeared before judges on televideo who were sitting in other states, other places. They were not down there on the border. But that's how they've dealt with a lot of the crush of cases. They have judges sitting all across the U.S., but there is simply a crushing backlog at this point.
Yeah, and a backup in the court system in general in this country. Well, what's really needed is, in addition to that, from our side, what we really need is some reforms in some of these Central American countries.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I mean, good Lord. I mean, you think of and we are partly responsible for some of the conditions that are in these Central American countries.
I think there has to be, bilateral responses to this situation. I'm not really privy to what is happening diplomatically. I read what everybody else reads. The president of El Salvador recently came out and said, this is our problem. It's our fault that people are leaving. That's great to take responsibility. I don't know what's happening. I'm really just a local immigration
Well, you
attorney.
think of the history. I mean, good Lord. You had the Sandinistas down there, right?
In Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua. Good Lord. I mean, and they killed nuns, for crying out loud. Remember that infamous case down there?
Well, that was, I'm not sure I'm getting the exact reference. I mean, there was a group of nuns that were killed in El Salvador back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Not in Nicaragua by the Sandinistas.
Okay, but we're still talking about Central America.
Sure. Yeah.
And that is right now the source of our problem.
Right. I mean, the politics have changed at that time. The Sandinistas were the rebels in Nicaragua. Now they're the official government.
Right.
There are no civil wars per se, but you now have this terrible scourge of gangs that are more powerful than the national governments in certain parts of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
Of course, what you hear from Trump is that's who's coming to America. M13, M13,
yeah,
heaven forbid, M13.
Yeah, and one problem is that people are falsely accused of being members of MS-13, and even when they have legitimate asylum claims, they're being kept from pursuing those because they're incorrectly labeled. And so, there are a lot of just injustices that are occurring because the immigration officials get it wrong. They will do a name search and come up with a similar name or a similar birth date, but there's no other indication that the person is disqualified from asylum other than they say, oh, you must be this person in this gang database. And in fact, it turns out that the person doesn't have any gang tattoos and has no connections and has corroborating evidence that they were fleeing the gangs, not that they were a member of the gangs. So, every case is unique and every case deserves good advocates on the person's side. One of the unfortunate things about immigration law is it does not provide the right to counsel. It does provide the right to an attorney at the person's own expense, and that keeps a lot of deserving people from getting legal representation. So it's not like criminal defense where you're at least ensured a public defender. There are no public defenders in the immigration
They're
field.
not entitled to legal representation?
Not at all, no. There's a regulation that says they are entitled to legal representation at their own expense.
So that's why you folks are doing pro bono work, right?
We have to do some pro bono work for sure, and a lot of, the agencies in Chicago, like National Immigrant Justice Center, of the Heartland Alliance, Catholic Charities, World Relief, they are all flooded with cases. They don't have the resources. NIJC relies a lot on their outreach efforts to large law firms that will have some resources to provide pro bono services to asylum seekers, but it's not nearly enough. There are a lot of people who fall through the cracks.
Well, you're describing a system that basically says because they're undocumented immigrants, they have no constitutional rights.
Their constitutional rights are whatever process is given to them. That's considered to be due process
By
for
this
immigrants.
administration.
Well, no, this is the way it's been since I've been practicing
Okay.
over 30 years ago.
It's not just this administration.
No.
Unfortunately, this administration has made it worse.
Well, one of the things that I have been telling people under this administration is they should understand how the system works and who is more vulnerable than others. So you've got U.S. citizens who are terrified that ICE is going to come and pick them up or take them away. We have to inform people, like, what are the actual priorities for enforcement? What are the defenses that people can have if they are picked up? What are their legal rights to remain silent, to not give information
What are
to
their
ICE?
defenses if they're picked up?
Well, there are certain defenses that are available for people who have U.S. citizen or lawful resident relatives who have been residing in the U.S. for many years, who fear going back to their countries due to a fear of persecution or torture. There are a number of defenses in the laws that, of course, are not highlighted in all of these threatening pronouncements.
Well, the thing that has always been most troubling to me is that they are taking some of these people who have DACA, for example, who were raised in this country, who were brought to this country as children, who in some instance now the Trump administration wants to take those individuals. They may be, I think some of them are as old as 26, 27, 28 years old, been in this country all their lives. Send them back to a country in which they've never lived, in which they have no contacts and no relationship. That's disturbing to me.
Just about every positive protection in our laws for immigrants has been threatened or terminated by the Trump administration. There's DACA, there's TPS, temporary protected status,
right,
for Haitians, for other nationalities whose countries are in turmoil. So this is no surprise. And so far, the courts have stepped in. The ACLU has done its job fabulously. And, hopefully that the courts will continue to be the bulwark against these
We got one
initiatives.
call from Paul from Seattle. Paul, you got a couple of minutes here. Better make it quick.
Yeah, Dick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to make a point here that's I hope is not lost on the listeners. The reason that these migrants, are not entitled to representation is because this is not criminal law. This is civil law. Now, most of the people listening think these are criminals, and that's why they're being locked up. This is civil law we're talking about. That's why attorneys have to do it pro bono if these people don't have don't have any money. And I just went to a law luncheon on this not too long ago. We had an immigration attorney speaking. I'm sure you're familiar with these kinds of things. You know, of the unaccompanied minors, 75% of them go before an immigration magistrate without representation. 75% go before without representation, and 90% of them lose their case. These are children who are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old standing in front of a magistrate without representation. The 25% that do get representation, 90% of them do win their case. So we're talking about civil law. And the other thing is, Dick, yeah, the Constitution doesn't apply to citizens or not citizens. The Constitution applies to the United States government as a charter of governance for the government. It's not citizens that only entitled. That's what most people think of this that we're talking about here. And because these people are not citizens, they're not entitled to constitutional rights. Of course they're entitled to constitutional rights. The Constitution is a restraint, a governor on the United States government.
Paul, thank you very much. Scott, you agree with that?
I agree with about 90% of what Paul just said. Yeah.
Okay, Scott Pollock, immigration attorney, Pollock and Associates in the city of Chicago, right?
Correct.
And they can get in touch with you by looking you up under that name?
Absolutely. Pollock.
Okay. All right. Any relation to the painter? Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming in here. I really do, and thanks for taking your time out and spending a great deal of time and going over a lot of the information on the undocumented, and which is a major problem for us. Thanks, Scott, a lot.
Thank you.
I'm Dick Kay, sitting in for Joan Esposito. This is Live, Local, and Progressive.